places. I tried to find some little connections between us. And then when I was thinking about Marija and what could be the connections between, it's this kind of multiple identities and struggle and burden of that past, and past that you cannot actually escape even when you leave the country. Meaning I left Yugoslavia 20 years ago and still with me every day, partly because I also teach the language, and then there is a connection with Olivia's grandma, who wrote first Teach Yourself Serbo-Croat in 1963, from which, not exactly that version, but a later edition I was using in my teaching when I started doing that. But also Petrovac, where you first ever visited what used to be Yugoslavia. And that is the place where around the same time, 97, 98, I first came, and my daughter first take bath. Her first swim was in that kind of a water, and my son was conceived there, so, you know, like lots of kind of connections, and we are on the same left, and on the same side, yeah? And then Vesna, wounds, and many wounds that we maybe still have, and then they don't all heal, some heal. So the reason why you wrote this book is because you were very ill, and you wanted actually it as a kind of a some sort of testimony for your son to know where his mom is from, and so it's almost like an accidental book about Yugoslavia as well. And I will read just a tiny little bit from it. It says, "It's probably because I left while Yugoslavia still existed that some kind of severe limb still twitches there in my imagination. People ask me, where are you from? And I say Yugoslavia, and then I have to step back and say Serbia, and it feels artificial. I used to madly romanticize those 1920s Russian exiles with their old passports, and suddenly I find myself having documents from a country which no longer exists." And then in that book you kind of imagine this connection between the breaking up of Yugoslavia, breaking up of your own body because of the illness. So if you were to write that book again, would it be the same book, or would it be a slightly different book?
It would probably be a very different book, although I don't think that message would necessarily be different. But you have this, Mikhail Bakhtin wrote somewhere that every memory consists of itself and of each subsequent memory of it. And so memory itself changes as you think. And what happened with Chernobyl Strawberries, which is very, very strange, since you say I wrote it for my son at the point when I thought that I had about 6 months left to live. I wanted him to remember the country I came from, even if he never visited or spoke the language. But I never thought it would become a big bestseller. And that was very, very strange. It sold probably the equivalent of 250 or 300,000 copies across Europe in many languages. And you now have the experience of the book. So I sometimes talk to my family and I say, next one I write will be Chernobyl Strawberries, the truth. And the reason for that is that when you're very ill and you think that your life may be ending, there is a kind of rosy image, which is not really a desire to embellish things, but a desire just to see the beautiful things. I didn't want to write about the war. I didn't want to write about the traumas of Yugoslavia. I had enough of my own trauma at that point. I was often put on the spot because of that. I had reviews in newspapers saying, why didn't you write about Srebrenica? And I said, well, F off. I haven't been in Srebrenica. I have nothing to add to that story. I was writing my own story. You realize what a huge burden it is when you write in English a story of a life of someone in some different country, the other end of the world. You're sort of almost expected to provide sociology, geography, history in a book, and that becomes more burdensome as time passes, because I now give readings from Chernobyl Strawberries. So when it was serialized on the BBC and I read it, it was very fresh and people still remembered the war. But believe me, there are lots of people around the world who have no idea where Yugoslavia is, have no idea that the war happened, they don't know who the Serbs are, they don't know who the Croats are, and they say, why didn't you put a map in your book? A map of what, right? It's a kind of, in a sense, I love that book, but I also grew tired of it because I found myself as a kind of interpreter of all sorts of things that I don't necessarily feel a desire to interpret. I walked into this room about 10 to 4, and this documentary about Zvezda was going on, coming to its end, and I had a Proustian moment, a memory of Zvezda cinema in Belgrade, because I went to it many times, but this was one of my earliest visits, so it would have been about 71, 72, I can check that on Wiki, and I was about 10 or 11, and Zvezda was showing 1001 a Night by Pier Paolo Pasolini. And I read it was 1001 Nights, so I thought, okay, I'm going to go to see this. And I walked into the cinema, and within minutes there were lots of very, very naked men. And it's a kind of powerful memory, because in former Yugoslavia, there was no film classifications. You bought a ticket if you were 10 or 13 or 15, went in, and I thought, why didn't anyone stop me? It could have ruined my sex life for the rest of times. But I still remember Pier Paolo Pasolini, and I watched all of his subsequent films in that same Zvezda cinema. And it is a beautiful Yugoslav moment that you could watch those films. It wasn't some kind of communist state where those films would be banned. You know, it is Pasolini, but I could have given any number of other examples. So I don't necessarily spend my time worrying that Yugoslavia no longer exists. I'm very happy with what is going on there at the moment, if that's what people want to. I'm not dictating anything to anyone, but I have only happy memories of that place.
Okay, so for people who haven't read the book, how you would sum it up? You know, what is Yugoslavia for you? I will come back with with one chapter which is called The Name of the Mother, which is for me very important in that book, and especially because there is this mothers and overbearing mothers and theme of mothers coming now through this panel. But I would like you to kind of try to sum it up.
It's a very difficult one. I say somewhere that when I look at the map of Europe, I still see Yugoslavia. The republics rearrange themselves, whatever they are now, and I still see the outline of Yugoslavia just as it is. 2 weeks ago I went to Montenegro, and I took my Serbian mobile phone because I thought it would be very cheap to use it in Montenegro, because somehow in my head I can't see it as a place of separate states. This is to do with the fact that I left in 1984, and I was 23, and I had a whole life away from Yugoslavia, and the whole kind of disintegration happened without me. So just as I have a phone book at home which is full of dead people, which I couldn't cross out because I don't know whether they're dead or alive, so I see that country, and for me it's still alive, right? Which doesn't mean that I live in a kind of illusion, but it means that I left it at the time before it disintegrated. So as I say, it still continues to exist like some kind of twitching limb for me.
It's interesting because also when someone, of course, you don't almost you speak without an accent, which is, so you still can disguise yourself.
My students usually think that I'm South African, and those who don't think that I'm South African think that I'm Israeli. I have no idea why. Maybe because my name begins with gold, or they just But I think it is also because when you teach, I teach 19th century English literature, and when you teach English literature in an English literature department, they don't assume that you're Serbian. Yeah, it's but I am very Serbian as well as very Yugoslav, and I want to add to my story is slightly different from these here, in that in my family I had ardent communists, I had royalists, I had Chetniks, every which way you want to paint it, I had them in my family, very often at the same dinner table, and we fought in a way which would make Scorsese want to film us. So I'm congenitally able to hold two different points of view in my head, because it's a kind of early training, if you want. And that the kind of differences of opinion never bothered me. When I say every which way, my grandmother, who was Montenegrin, was also the greatest Serbian nationalist of us all, and she had a very feudal point of view, which is that the world was divided into Turks and into what she called Shokci, Catholics, and into us, which is the Serbs. My mother, her daughter-in-law, who was a very ardent communist, although she refused to join the Communist Party, would say vi. very formal you to my grandmother, and they would have these kind of very polite rows, because my grandmother would sort of fire off one of her 16th century or 15th century statements. So you can imagine how it was growing up in my house.
Excellent. No, there is many very interesting kind of moments in that chapter called The Name of the Mother, where you say how you've been told this epic story like Marija Ratkovic, where there are heads flowing around, you know, and things like that, which your mother deemed really inappropriate for a small girl to listen, you know, as a bedtime story. But then your grandmother telling your husband how to preserve a human head, you know.
That was a huge surprise to me. I never thought, so, okay, we're sitting at dinner, my husband very politely, having a polite conversation, English, speaks a bit of Serbian, and the conversation turns to beheadings, as it does when you talk about smrt Smajla Ratkovic, the death of Smajla Ratkovic. And my grandmother suddenly says that pickling human heads is more efficient way of preserving them than, I can't even remember what the other alternative was, the salt, yeah, that's right. And I said, how do you know this? And she winks at me. It's really, I think she was trying to kind of pass on a message to my husband that he better not leave me, if you see what I mean. This was actually very, very funny, and that was one of his first memories of Belgrade, right? Anyway, there we are.
Excellent. So this film that we watched, again mentioning mother, I felt the figure of your mother pretty kind of I would say, controlling, overbearing. I reminded myself, Svetlana, you should not be that kind of finishing your daughter's sentences and things like that. So Yugoslavia features in your film, but also family as a kind of a mentality that kind of came into being in that, let's say, system, you know, and it got this, despite the, let's say, socialist history, there is a very strong patriarchal kind of structure that I see you wanted kind of also, in a way, to replace with slightly different. So I don't know whether it's a slightly ironic or self-ironic that last, you know, in a strong, bold colors, you know, last scenes of your film, you know, where you're in a Swedish colors and there is a flag waving and all, it's like you're kind of almost like worshipping nature and things like that, as if abandoning this whole kind of baggage of that space that you find kind of suffocating, you know, not only country but the memories, the legacies, and also the family bonds.
Well, you can watch it that way, because it's actually the celebration of Midsummer, which is most Swedish thing in Sweden, I would say. But you could also watch it in a way that when I never danced, I never liked to dance in my life. It's really not my kind of thing. And then when it is first third of the movie, when my mother makes us to dance in Kozaračko kolo, I don't know. Yeah. And then in this last scene, I dance as well, but not to Kozaračko kolo, I dance to Swedish Midsummer song. I mean, you can watch that it's the same thing, but in a different variation. So yeah, you can, like you said, you can run, but you cannot hide. It always
Catching up with you.
Yeah.
And after now exploration for this new novel, Olivia, do you have an urge to kind of go and really maybe base yourself there, to kind of spend more time and really feel what it's like, you know, being there, or you will do it kind of from a distance?
So I'm spending a bit of time there. Obviously I haven't set it in Belgrade or Montenegro, where I have the most obvious connections to, but I also haven't set very much of it there. It's more like a memory. And so in a way, what I'm relying on is trying to draw on bits of my past where I have maybe created, or actually like what you said, it was the Mikhail Bakhtin quote about memory, and when you obviously write a memoir, then you freeze the memory and you can't overlay it in the same way, and depending on what stage of life you're at, depending on what else is going on in your life, it will be coloured very different ways. So I guess I could embed myself there more, but I wouldn't I don't know, I guess then, if I was making a documentary film, that's exactly what I would do. I would worry a little bit about feeling a little bit, not parasitic, but that I was sort of just observing people and writing down all their things, whereas I kind of want to rely more on the sense that she doesn't know what it is that she lacks, only that there is something missing. And so I spent, you know, like, I'd say 3 or 4 days there at a time, and I'll probably go back one more time, but I feel like the research, I don't feel like it's my place to write something which relies on one version of the facts or the kind of historical accounts. Obviously I spent a lot of time reading a mixture of like personal testimony and some histories and going to various museums. But like when I mentioned that the War Childhood Museum, that I think for me was really important because it was focusing on these objects without a kind of research angle to them. I'm not anti-research, obviously. I feel like often I'm in danger of wanting to write another type of book if I embed myself too much in research, and I'm drawing on other. I mean, I've even been reading a little bit about the PKK and sort of, you know, like the idea of not having a kind of recognized country for yourself, all those kind of things, they're coming into it maybe more than exactly Yugoslavia. I'm sort of using that as a kind of analogy for some other things. But yeah, I would like to spend more time there in general because I'd never been to Sarajevo before and it was utterly incredible. And I had watched films and I can't remember what the title of that film is called. Is it like 360 Days of Red or something, where there are these two competing films made originally, a little bit like in the cinema where they can't agree in the end on how to make this film, so they make two very closely identical but different versions, and both are screened at all the same film sort of awards shows. I sort of feel like I've swallowed a lot of that, but it's almost now the time to put all of that aside so it doesn't end up swamping what is otherwise a narrative about belonging.
So Vladimir, after we watched IKEA for you, we had a tiny little chat because your daughter is slightly younger than Mikula, than Marija's son, and maybe now it's kind of this generational thing where you are passing on a legacy because your child is growing up outside of that country, but you kind of carry it with you in a myriads of ways, you know. So, and you said that actually the film, because of that aspect, resonated quite a lot with you. So I would like to hear that kind of a next stage of, you know, what is Yugoslavia to you now when you have your own children?
Yeah, it's so difficult. I try not to think about it, but how do you pass values on to children? Do you try to do that? How much do you let them do their own thing? God forbid. I don't know. At the moment, I think my daughter is the one who's in command. But I'd like to think at some point I'll turn the tables. It's difficult. I don't know. I mean, in a sense, the one thing I would say is I do speak to her in my language, whatever that's called. And her mum speaks Italian to her. Between mum and myself, we speak my language because we met in the Yugoslav archives. And in English, well, so usually in nursery she speaks English or a Glaswegian derivation. They're all. It's great. Whenever I ask her, do you want some toast? She says, toast? No. So, I mean, I think on some level, part of my own experience has been a kind of an attempt at a departure from the particular of the Yugoslav experience, and more of an attempt at understanding what's universal. Perhaps as a Marxist you would expect this. So, in a sense, I'd like her to understand the standpoint of the exploited, the oppressed, wherever she is, and I don't fundamentally care what she'll think about me or my country where I grew up.
Yeah, that's what I also think, because in bringing up my children, I think that actually those values that are kind of inherited, that were inherited to socialist Yugoslavia, you passed almost unconsciously onto your children. So solidarity, cooperation, you know, being really not into this individualistic, just caring for your own whatever path, career, you know, and your own well to good, but actually always caring for others. It's something that becomes ingrained there, and it is a legacy, I would say, of what we've been taught and how we've been brought up. But because we took already a whole hour, even though with us it felt like 10 minutes, yeah? It didn't feel like an hour. Excellent. That's what we feel, yeah? So I would like now to open the floor. So for questions that could be similar to that have been discussed, but I would like actually to hear maybe something else, or maybe something, a provocation, or something that would completely throw everything that we said, you know, in a mud and say it's all rubbish, you know, give us some beef, you know, something more, or better, or more provocative, you know.
Very rare you have a questioner say it doesn't have to be a question at the end.
Yeah.
Normally it's like,
Just don't give us lectures.
Yeah, don't give us lectures and don't comment on our accent or, you know, things like that. You know, we did our best.
I'm happy to take a lecture or a discussion about
Yes,
it.
because you're lecturing your students throughout the years.
No, sorry, I just have this thing when in public events. This is not really a question, but
yeah.
and then you go on for about 10 minutes.
Exactly.
I can't follow that. Sorry.
Okay, so where do we have a question? First question from. Do we have a mic in
Yes,
the?
I am in charge of the mic.
Huh?
Yeah.
You have a mic.
Yeah.
Okay, excellent.
Questions, comments, observations?
Yeah. Comments and observations, welcome.
You were applauding before. Can you tell us why you were applauding?
Just when you mentioned goodbye lines, so that's the reason, because I watched that film.
Oh, we couldn't hear that.
Vladimir mentioned, sorry.
I did applaud when Vladimir mentioned the goodbye line. So that's because that film was very, I don't know, special to me. Especially one scene when he was choking on an apple while he was shouting freedom, freedom, but he ended up in hospital. So I found that moment very funny and very subtle.
I suppose this is more of a comment probably, but I'm happy for you to share your views as well. I was very interested by Vladimir's contribution because I'm of a similar age. I was born in Sarajevo, I then moved to South Africa and then to England. But one of the things, and you know, my parents were very pro-Yugoslavia, so I grew up in that sort of mentality, and I loved Yugoslavia as well. And one of the consequences that that has had, because Yugoslavia no longer exists, is that I then came to love the European Union a lot, because for me that symbolises a unity of lots of different nations living together. And I know there are obviously negative sides to it, and I know when I speak to people in Serbia, people are very split. So I don't want necessarily to make a political comment, but I know that when I speak to my fellow colleagues in the UK, that's one of the things that I always am very passionate about. So I'm happy for you to obviously say your views, but I just wanted to say that was my experience.
that was something that prompted, other things I mentioned, some of my work, but equally, you know, again, it's one of those things that can't be idealized. It's obviously got all these problems to it, but I just sort of feel like, at least from the UK perspective, half of those problems are things that we need to deal with internally. And so, you know, when like recently in either Belgrade or so on, you see posters where obviously like it's very much a kind of Russian influence and it's very, very anti-European. And I don't know, that actually made me dig my heels in a bit more. I sort of feel very similarly in terms of really admiring at least the aim and the motivation, rather than maybe the kind of bureaucratic intricacies of how power is, you know, actually. But I feel like there's someone over here who might say something different. So.
Probably would, but maybe.
Come on. No, we want a different opinion.
I'd like to meet you, so if you want to stick around afterwards, it'd be quite cool to chat. I'm thinking of a childhood memoir myself, which I'll posthumously publish. It won't see the light of day, but yeah, I mean, the only thing I would say about the European Union, which I know is a very difficult thing to talk about now in Britain, and specifically when you're a foreigner, and at this moment in time, you know, when I was younger, I felt the same, and I was very intrigued by what was mentioned in the film, where your mum talked about it in the same kind of way, and in fact, frequently my mum did as well. And there's a kind of famous quotation from Romano Prodi, who was the European Commission president, about how we all have to learn to live as a minority. So in that aspect, I can fully, you know, sign up to. I just don't think that the European Union has made will serve that purpose, to be honest. You know, I went to Greece during the last couple of years, and I felt that the way that Europe, but not just Europe, you know, the global powers treated Greece was shocking. You know, Tsipras was up there. I have a selfie with Tsipras, and I'm kind of semi-ashamed of it now. And I'll kind of, I should just wrap up. But I mean, what I would say is, what I think the Yugoslav experience, in a sense, taught me, for all its faults, was, brotherhood and unity, and people can live together. By the way, Yugoslavia was not like that either. I mean, the Albanians never lived as an equal nation, and I don't think in the European Union everyone's equal. But I think more fundamentally, the European Union as such, I think, is a project of big capital, and it's, you know, the missing word in all the discussion is imperialism, and it's a left-wing word. It's not the kind of word that Boris Johnson's going to use because Boris Johnson's in favour of imperialism. I'm not, and I want that to end, and I think the only way it can end is if we overthrow the structures that exist, including the European Union. So I mean, that's you know, for what it's worth, I wanted to say it because I don't think that's in the mainstream at all.
I just want to say thank you first to all of you for being here today. And my mom made a very interesting comment, because I'm Serbian, my friends are Croatian, my friend is Slovenian. She grew up in Yugoslavia, and she said that it's amazing that we all just came here tonight together just to watch, you know, movies from all other countries, and we didn't really live in Yugoslavia as such at the time. So she just saw it as magical. But I want to ask you guys, how, living in different countries, how do you feel your identities changed as you sort of stayed in Sweden or in the UK, or even you who were brought up here, but you kind of have that Yugoslavian identity? Do you feel that your identity sort of is something different today as it was maybe whenever many years ago when you moved to your relevant countries?
I'll go first, just because it's funny. My mother is English, so or British, or I don't think she really identifies as English. But when I go back, I feel like I am claimed by family members there, and that's become a really nice thing. And this event is probably the first time I feel like I've been claimed. And I feel great about it. I feel like, oh, there's, I don't know, even just simple things like when the first time I went to Belgrade and I was on, I think, a tram or something, I was looking at other people's bone structure and I was like, yes. There's something about this that makes me feel, I don't know, like slotting into place in a way that I don't know, it's very difficult to put into words, but it does feel kind of reassuring. And certainly when random relatives sort of pop out from behind bushes and say, I'm your cousin, I'm like, well, great. And that, I feel like it's become a more positive thing as I've grown up. Something that I feel like it hasn't changed my identity so much as made certain things make sense, like especially things about why my dad was silent on certain subjects, why my grandma, like just so many things that when you're growing up as a kid, there are tensions that you absolutely pick up on but you can't put words to. And so I guess it's been a feeling almost of like validation of certain things to learn more about the history and so on. So I feel like things make sense more, which is not necessarily something, that you could say of lots. The more you study Yugoslavia, like you say, the less you can kind of pin down. But it does feel like things have materialized in a kind of helpful way for me.
Well, I would end with a little story. In 2008, Marija, did you want to say something now? So in 2008, my daughter, who was 7 at the time, and I was terribly nostalgic at that year, I don't know what happened, but we were sitting on a riverbank on Danube in Novi Beograd, Zemun actually, and it was a beautiful August day, you know, and sun and the river and the little fisherman boats and everything like that. And I really wanted to persuade her to, you know, to return to Belgrade. And I said,